There was a list processing language, supposedly.
I saw a poem once, maybe it was written around that time, where it was basically one sentence, but there was, thousands of parenthetical statements.
Something, yes, exactly.
Yeah. It's
Impossible.
impossible to read.
It was up to you, I think, to remember in your head how everything was arranged in the sequence, right?
Yeah.
So the deal is, everyone always seems to be a few minutes late.
Uh-huh.
And then the additional thing is, nothing starts this early in the morning except classes. So I won't be surprised if people trickle in.
Maybe a few more minutes.
Yeah? How many more minutes?
Well, 5 minutes is usually, everyone's usually 5 minutes late at least. And then we'll have like an additional
So for extra occasion, we're 2 more minutes.
For me, they're going to be 10 minutes. Very thoughtful.
Well, it's for the before noon start time, so.
So we also have a problem with the elevators. They move like this, like all 4 of them go together. So if you are in the wrong phase, you have to wait like for 5 minutes just to get through.
I've waited for as long as 15 minutes for an elevator once.
Wow.
Yeah, I usually take my
It's a
I usually take my iPad with me so I can get some work done while I'm waiting.
Wow. That's the most productive part of the day.
Yeah,
Well, at least
sometimes
the elevator's in the
emails.
center of the building. If the elevator at the side of the building, then they all went to the top of the building by top.
But I guess it's like maybe it's like because of this. The whole building was built like in 70s. It was like the main institution that was making this all the analysis.
Well,
And that-
Patrick already explained it was built by economists, right?
Exactly. And the elevators haven't changed since then. So they're like 30-something years old. So maybe they're programmed like central planning. They all move together.
40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's amazing, like this Finnish. It's like I think this Finnish company should like advertise all the time. We have 4 elevators that are running in Moscow for 40 years.
I vote Anton's here, so why don't we get started?
Okay, so yeah, you're the main guy. We've waited.
Constantine disappeared.
Yes, well, okay.
It's okay.
Okay, let's wait for
What is the total count of our faculty now?
with new, including you and your cohort.
And the 3 other people that were hired this year?
Then it will be officially 29, of which, like, overall, which is retiring. Official figure was 25.
So how many?
Give one figure. 28.
28, yeah. On average, 28. But discounting, like, this seniors, like Makarov or both.
And of the 28, 26 are assistant professors.
No. Number constitute the we have, like, now we have 5 or 6 professors.
Okay, so we have about 30% of the untenured people here now.
Yeah. Oh, if that was the people.
No.
We should subtract these 3 guys that are not here.
Yes,
That are not in this country.
Not in this country at all.
Yeah. Well,
So then it's more than.
Then it's
Yeah, I think
like
it's 4.
half.
We can start. Majority, like half of the junior.
So should we start?
Yeah. I think it's
So thank you much for inviting me to come and talk with you about this stuff. It's been sort of an evolving sequence of talks. Half a dozen years ago, I talked sort of about this, and it was 4 talks, and it took many hours or something. And I've been trying to compress things down and get rid of, well, it used to start with a research report when I did a mathematical statistical analysis of the reliability of journal reviewing. And I think that's very important information, but a lot of people found it was like too much. So I've tried to pick the most important elements of that out and scatter it through the first 2 talks. But basically the idea is to start with a really general, overall strategic look at where are you trying to go with your research life. Not your life in general, but insofar as you're trying to get ahead someplace as an academic, think strategically. And then tomorrow I'll try to home in a much more practical way on the issues of dealing with journals. That's both a psychological problem for you and a tactical problem for the negotiations with the journals. And then the last talk on Friday morning is at the most microscopic level, looking at the actual structure of sentences and paragraphs and things like that in your articles, in the interest of trying to make them more interesting, more readable, and more attractive to readers. That doesn't necessarily mean it will make them more likely to be accepted. I think in general it does help if what you write is more readable. But if you write crap and it's really readable, it's still crap. So I can't help with that. So what I want to talk about today are these topics. I want to start out and just talk about what we know about the low reliability of journal reviews. This is a pervasive issue. I'll mention it again tomorrow. Journal reviews are very undependable information about the quality of what you're doing. And then transition from that to how do you pick some research topics and how do you sell your research, which are 2 interdependent issues. And then because of the low reliability of journal reviews, I want to end up by talking about the importance of being persistent and of nest building. One of my general themes is you always start with one of the most important issues, and you always end with one of the most important issues. And so nest building, I think, is on the end because I think it's highly important. And the low reliability of journal reviews is at the beginning because I think it's highly important. You just simply can't escape this. And I think I'll show you evidence that it doesn't seem to vary very much from one field to another. This is a statement by a Belgian statistician in a statistics journal. One of the central issues here that he points out implicitly is that this is a problem in the reliability of human perceptions. It's like, can you tell the difference between 2 jewels, right? And if you can't look at the jewels with a knowledgeable eye and make a judgment between them, how can you decide which is more valuable, right? One might be bigger, but the other one might be shinier, and so on. That's exactly the problem that the people who evaluate research have, including you and me. 16 journals have reported on the correlation between 2 reviewers. These are the statistics that they have reported, right? The average correlation between 2 reviewers across these 16 reports is 0.18. That's a very, very low correlation, right? This is what it means in a practical sense. This is a correlation of 0.18. Imagine that the horizontal axis is the quality of your work, and the vertical axis is the judgments that reviewers make about it, right?
It's impressive it's not a negative correlation.
Oh, No, wait. No, sorry, you soon find out it is. But this is over all the different papers, all right? I'll show you these statistics later. If this correlation is almost entirely due to the best 10%. If you take that best 10% of the manuscripts out of the pile, the correlation is negative. All right. But it's very close to zero. Right? But what this says is, you see, that if you write one of the very best papers written this year, the reviewers are going to rank it anywhere from the bottom 10% to the top, right? The best you can hope for is that very few are going to say it's one of the worst papers they've ever seen, right? Similarly, if you write one of the worst papers written this year, you've got a good chance that somebody's going to think it's pretty good, right? But it's not good information for you to help you decide, are you doing well? This is just a statistical fact. Every journal rejects more of the best papers they receive than they publish. Of the papers they publish, at least half are not among the best papers they got. Similarly, you can write one of the best papers written this year and submit it to a journal, have it rejected, submit it to another journal, have it rejected, and go through as many as 5 journals in a row and still have a non-zero probability of rejection on the 5th. Right? No assurance here that the first journal is going to recognize your brilliance. This is specifically about a very prestigious economist. The papers that have been rejected include ones that were cited in Nobel Prizes. Right? And this is another way of looking at what you could tell if you just try to say, how much do I gain by looking at the best journals versus the worst journals? This is the gray line, is the distribution of all the manuscripts written this year, and this is on a log normal curve, right? These are logarithms here. So the distribution is actually skewed far to the right. This is the best 20% of the journals. And this is the bottom 40% of the journals. Now the bottom 40% look very like the population of written manuscripts, right? Everything. The best 20% are better, clearly, but there's a tremendous overlap in here, that the best 20% of the journals are publishing a lot of articles that are not very different from the average, including some that are a full standard deviation down below the mean.
Not that it's relevant to your point, but how are you measuring manuscript quality?
Now, you start with it as an assumption and use the statistics about reviewers to generate what the consequences of the reviewers' actions would be. This is my little paper I published in 2005, where I start with those statistics about what reviewers do, right? And work through what are the implications for, yeah. Now, are the fields different? If you look at this question from a totally different kind of data, you say, what do we know about the stratifications of journals in terms of the citations to different journals? That is, if people think that the American Economic Review is the very best, they should cite it much more than they do, I don't know, the International Journal of, I don't know, Fidelity Instruments or something, right? So we look at the actual observed ratios of citations to more prestigious journals versus less prestigious journals, and we say, how does this differ across the different fields? As you can see, these numbers are very similar. Which part of the distribution you look at doesn't seem to make much difference. And the fields are very similar, except that psychologists appear to have more confidence in their reviewers than other people do, and sociologists have somewhat less confidence in their reviewers. But it also strikes me that there's a lot of unrealism in this, because remember, the reported statistics are only 0.18, the correlation between reviewers, whereas these are about almost twice as high. So most academics, apparently in their citation patterns, are acting as if reviewers are more reliable than they really are, right? In other words, we're attributing quality based on where things were published, rather than on the content of the articles themselves. Does that make sense? Now, we all know that, but it's terrifying to have it statistically demonstrated, right? So what does this tell us about how to go ahead with our lives? A very central problem for all of us is, do you want to be a big frog in a little pond, or a little frog in a big pond? Right? That was something my father kept saying to me, right? Of course, his assumption was I would be the same size frog, whatever the pond, right? And I could only choose the pond and not my size, right? But it's an important question. How much of a specialist do you want to be? How much do you want to focus on one thing or another? The other thing we pretty much know, based on modern strategic management talk, is VRIN. Is that? Oh yes, you're frowning, aren't you? Yes. Well, that's current strategic management talk for the elements in competitive advantage. Valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. If you can create a product that is valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable, you can get more profit than your competitors, right? Thus, I would infer that's what you want in your research. You want to generate research that is valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. Now, some of those parts are hard to do. One of my good examples of this, though, is a man named Edward Chamberlain. I'm sure you all know who he is. No? Are you looking blank?
It is the same Chamberlain.
What?
I know
Is it
Chamberlain.
I don't know his first name, but...
In the early
British Prime Minister?
What?
British Prime Minister?
No, that guy had an A at the end of his word. L-A-I-N, I think. Now, this guy was a graduate student at the University of Michigan in economics, and he had a paper to write for a course. And the paper that he read was about the pricing of goods along a railroad line. And the paper argued that you could sell your goods for different prices depending on how far they were from the place where they were manufactured, because you had to pay the shipping cost. A rather elementary idea, right? If you have multiple shipping points and so forth, it got to be an elaborate little paper. So Edward Chamberlain wrote his essay for his course about this, and then he said to his professor, I want to write my dissertation about this topic. He said, I think this topic has great application throughout the field of economics, and I want to escalate this into major piece for my dissertation. His professor says, you're out of your mind. This is a stupid topic. So Ed Chamberlain was faced with a problem, right? What did he do? He left the University of Michigan and went to Harvard, where he enlisted as his advisor a man named Alan Young, who was at that time probably the most respected economist in the world. Alan Young was the chair of the department at Harvard. He was later a visitor at London School of Economics, and the University of Chicago invited him to go there to be the chair of their department. And he published on a whole wide range of topics in the top journals repeatedly. And a very respected guy. And Alan Young thought this idea made some sense. In particular, it matched with something Alan Young himself had written in 1908, a dozen years before, right? Chamberlain worked on this, and he finally produced his dissertation in 1927. And then he worked on it some more, and produced a book in 1933, which is one of the great classics of economics, A Theory of Monopolistic Competition. So Chamberlain was a guy who had a pretty good idea. He saw the essence of some wisdom in a fundamental idea, right? And he invested a big hunk of his life in developing this idea and making it a high quality product, first as a dissertation, then as a book, and then he got out and marketed it. He had to go to conferences and sell this whole thing and make a real big effort, right? At the same time, there was a woman named Joan Robinson at Cambridge who offered an alternative treatment of essentially this idea, and there was a big controversy as to which of these two people, but this helped them both in the sense that having a fight between two prominent economists helps a lot, right? Makes everybody more famous, right? Another thing you have to think about is, do you want to join the various fads and fashions that come along? And my own personal reaction is that this is probably not a good idea. My wife and I wrote a paper about a year ago about the fads and fashions in organization theory, and it seemed very clear to me that in that field, at least, the various fads and fashions have been initiated at prestigious departments with large numbers of doctoral students. And so somebody there, the 2 or 3 professors get this idea, and they get a dozen doctoral students all enthusiastic, and then they send them out as disciples around the world, right? And you get this thing that goes on for maybe 10 or 15 years when everybody writes about it, but pretty soon it fizzles out like all of them do. But what happens is, if you look at this, the people who come in from other places, who come in later, are about 5 years behind the curve. And by the time they think of an idea and begin to do the research and get the paper out, it looks like old stuff, right? So if you're going to join a fad, don't be late, right? Get in there early in the process. But my general reaction is it's probably not a good way to start. This is probably the more reasonable approach to how to think about where you're going. I've been somebody who's sort of consistently let my environment tell me what to do. I've not been like Ed Chamberlain. As much as I can admire him, it seems to me that he had an awful lot of self-confidence in where he was and where he was going to go. But I do think it's often a good idea to be on to new things and to take a risk on doing something that's different from what everybody else is doing. And I think, at least for me, this has paid off more often than I've lost. Now, sure, anytime you take a gamble, you're going to lose some, you're going to win some. But most other people in the academic world are risk averse. And thus, people who have risk preference probably have an advantage, a small advantage, but a real advantage against those who are risk averse. But the a practical consequence of this is that the probability of your success when you do something that is risky is not just an environmental fact, it's a consequence of your own behavior. You can get out and sell what you're doing. Like Ed Chamberlain, he went out and sold what he was doing, and he might have done all that work and had a total flop if he had not undertaken a major marketing program to sell it. But he did do that. Now, you need obviously an independent identity. A lot of young people start out and they co-author with their dissertation chairs and things like that. And that can be very expensive for you. I had a colleague in New York, Raghu Garud, who did his dissertation at the University of Minnesota with a very well-known man named Andy Vandevet. And Raghu Garud, he studied cochlear ear implants at the 3M company. They, like how did they develop the technology and what happened, in its marketing and so on. And it was well understood that Raghu had done all the work. Andy had set up the initial contacts. He knew the people at 3M, but Raghu had gone in, he'd gotten the data, he'd written the papers, but the papers were all co-authored, Garud and Vandeven. And when Garud came up for review for tenure, the people in the room almost overwhelmingly said, well, Vandeven must have been the brains behind this. You know, Raghu is just this young guy just coming along. Why should we think that he knows anything? He couldn't have done this without Vandeven. Vandeven wrote a letter saying, no, this is all Garud, I'm just the co-author. It counted for very little, right? So that's the problem you have with working with really well-known people, is that they can help you with some stuff. They'll help you get into the journals. Your articles are more likely to be accepted if they're authored by somebody well-known from a prestigious department. So they can help with that, but the risk is that they will get the credit for having done the work. Another issue to be aware of is sort of a clannishness. Now I'm going to try to sell you on the idea of creating a clan here. But a side effect of having a clan is that clans can become quite intolerant of their members. There is a large clan at Harvard Business School of people who do behavioral decision theory. And a student goes in there, and their first paper, they're the 5th author, and then the next paper, they're the 4th author, and so on. And eventually, they're the first author of the paper, and that's their dissertation, and then they graduate. And we had a member of our faculty, a woman named Kim, who did all that, and she graduated and had this clan pushing her forward in her career, and then she got her own idea. And it had nothing to do with their previous stuff. It was her own distinctive idea about what she wanted to study. And they all turned against her. They all started saying bad things about her, and her research really wasn't worth paying attention to, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't because of the quality of her research. In fact, she got a good job at Duke University, because Duke University had a different opinion than the Klan, but the Klan behaved like, I don't know, that someone had broken the Girl Scout oath or something, right? And stepped out. Now, these are a couple of examples out of my own stuff, like where do I find topics? I was asked to teach forecasting, and I thought this was a wonderful idea. I'd always thought that the Oracle at Delphi must know something really wonderful, and I would like to know, how do you tell the future, right? So I would go into this subject, I would find out how to forecast the future. And of course, it was a kind of a disappointing experience, because I found it. But one of the things I discovered in the process was that forecasting people do not use squared error statistics. They don't calculate variances. They don't use ordinary regression techniques. Not this is very strange. Many of them have PhDs in statistics. And here are statisticians who don't use squared error statistics. Why is this? So I began investigating what's going on here. And that led to a whole line of stuff. I actually haven't published that. I was thinking this morning, and maybe I should publish something about this. But why is it, and starting in the early 80s, statisticians began to develop new techniques called robust statistical techniques, precisely because of the deficiencies of squared error statistics. But it's a kind of a new field that many people are not familiar with. And then, why did I get into the study of prestigious journals, and how much better are the most prestigious journals? Because our dean said that we had to identify, for the purposes of promotions and evaluations within NYU, we had to identify the A journals. And that only publications in A journals would count. B journals and C journals would not count. Specifically, they said for tenure at that time, at the end of 5 years, you had to have 6 publications in A journals, and for full professor, you had to have 10 publications in A journals. That was their formal thing. I just thought this was a crazy idea because I've reviewed for lots of journals, and I don't give different reviews for bad journals than for good journals. I'm reviewing the articles and not the journals, right? And it didn't make sense to me that they would place so much emphasis on one category of journals and ignore all the others. So I got into research about why is this happening. And then a Swedish friend called me up and said, would I come to Sweden and do a talk about knowledge-intensive firms? I said, yes, of course. But then my next problem was, what are knowledge-intensive firms, right? I don't know what knowledge-intensive firms are, and I have to go to Sweden and make a speech about them, right? So then I got off and I wrote a paper that got identified last year as a classic and got republished with commentaries and all this stuff about knowledge-intensive firms. But I published it first in 1992, and nobody cited it for 8 years because it was published at a time when the world wasn't ready for those ideas, right? So obviously, if you're operating in this kind of a world, you have to figure out how you're going to sell your stuff. And fortunately, one of the characteristics of this world is it isn't real, right? The reality is what we want to make it to be, and we can therefore go out and modify the reality. You just have to get out there and sell this product. You have to figure out what is it that will make these people buy what I'm selling, like it's toothpaste or soap or something, and you have to convince them that you know how to do that. One good paper, not today, but I'll give you a website, a hidden website that has a bunch of papers that you can read. And one of the papers on this site is a paper by some marketing guys who looked at the parallels between the selling of research and the selling of other products. And so they took the metaphor of selling goods in a market and translated that into what does that say about the selling of research results. But one of their most important points here is that you've got to have research on your market. You don't go out there with your own ideas about what the market's going to buy. If you develop a new product, your first steps are to go find out what do consumers want, right? Same way with your own research. You have to go do seminars and listen to the questions they have and then find ways to address their doubts. They're going to tell you, I don't believe what you're saying, or you don't have the right kind of data, or you ought to use different methods. You have to listen to all that and modify your product so that it will work in that with those consumers. You also have to think a bit about what is going to be your marketing strategy. How do I want to position myself in this market? You can go for a mass market. You can go for a small elite market. When I started out in 1960, I wanted to do mathematical models and laboratory experiments. I collaborated with a man named Vernon Smith, and he did experiments on groups of 20 to 40, and I did experiments on groups of 1 to 2. What I did then was what you call behavioral decision theory today. And I liked mathematics. I studied lots of mathematics in college. I knew more mathematics than most people do. I used to go to the very first meetings of the Econometric Society. And I loved that kind of stuff. But at some point, about 15 years later, I published this paper based on Russian mathematicians. There were some guys named Pontryagin and Mashenko and so forth who had been doing applied math. You had a version of mathematics that existed in Russia that did not exist in the Western world. It was sort of it was a less abstract application of partial differential equations, I guess, or just differential equations, ordinary differential equations. And I picked up some of this stuff, specifically a paper about the burning out of light bulbs, and I translated it into writings about revolutions and what are the conditions under which revolutions happen. And I published this thing, and then I realized there are only going to be 2 people in the world that are ever going to read this article. What am I doing with my life, right? Why am I writing things that only 2 or 3 people will ever read or care about, right? Nobody else can read this kind of mathematics. Mathematics alone isolates you from most of the population. But if you get down to something weird, like the mathematics of revolutions, you've got the whole market down to almost nothing. And so I just decided explicitly I would stop doing mathematics. I would learn to tell stories. I would learn to write better, and I would get more into the mass market, right? But I'm not telling you you should make that same choice, but I think you have to think through what are you trying to do here, right? This is another paper that you'll get from my website. It's a very important paper. It was first brought to me by a famous psychologist who said he'd read it and was very impressed by it. This man, Murray Davis, looked at, he's a sociologist, and he looked at the great works of sociology and said, why are these 12 or 15 books classics in sociology? How are they different from the great mass of things that are produced in sociology? And he came up with about 12 formulas. They're very simple formulas, and he kind of wrote them down in his article. This is one way you make, but he called the overall pattern. That's interesting, because after you read one of these books, you said, yeah, that's interesting. It surprised you. It left you with something that you hadn't anticipated before, right? You hadn't thought of the world in that way. And so he argued that if you want to write classic works, you have to get this property into what you're writing. Now, one of the basic patterns in Murray Davis's analysis is you want to create a tension in the writing. You want to establish that there's a contradiction. There's a contradiction between 2 theories, that they don't agree with each other. They're mutually inconsistent. There's a contradiction between what most people believe and what the facts are. There's a contradiction between what some famous person says and what you can demonstrate empirically, or whatever. You want to create a conflict and then resolve the conflict. Now, the conflicts can be resolved in various ways. One side can win, or you can show that there is in fact no conflict because it's an optical illusion that these 2 things, they're in fact 2 sides of the same thing, right? But you want to create that tension, and you want to do it very early in the article, at the beginning of the article, so that everybody comes in expecting you to resolve it. Another way to think about this, it's like a mystery story. There's a dead body on the table. How did the body get there, right? Who killed that person? And so now you have to puzzle out the mystery, but it has to be a real mystery. It shouldn't be something like there's a note on the body that says I killed the person, right? It actually has to be something that you contribute as the investigator. And now this is, I already mentioned my problem with my mathematical models and why I switched off. Here's a couple of other examples. Marlene Field was one of my colleagues. She was working on her doctoral dissertation about the letters that CEOs write to stockholders that they publish in their annual reports. This was a popular topic, a way of doing research in the 1980s. In the middle of her dissertation, she decided that a new field called semiotics would help her to understand this. So she stopped doing her dissertation and went off and got a master's degree in semiotics, and then came back and completed her dissertation using semiotics. Now she wants to publish her results. She discovered she had to write a textbook about semiotics every time she wrote an article, because no one else in the world understood what the hell was semiotics or what it had to say, right? And after she'd published about 2 articles, she got them into good journals, very good journals. But after she published about 2 articles, she couldn't stand it anymore, writing the textbook about what is semiotics. So she quit and went off to do something else. I've been on a campaign against null hypothesis significance tests. I'm not the first one. The campaigns against these tests started in 1932 by statisticians named Neyman and Pearson, who were quite famous. And they've gone on. Some of the most famous statisticians in the field of psychology once formed a pact and tried to campaign aggressively to get these tests banned from the psychology journals. They didn't succeed. And I've been going out and campaigning, and I don't expect ever to win, right? I just think that this is such an issue that I just have to keep beating on it, even though I'm going to fail, right? Oops. Obviously, if you're operating in a world like that graph at the beginning, you have to find a way to maintain yourself. It's hard to be enthusiastic in such a world. It's easier to be enthusiastic if you believe in what you're doing. One of the issues that I see among doctoral students is many of them want a career. They want to have a nice job someplace that will pay them a salary. And it seems to me it's really hard to maintain enthusiasm if that's the way you're viewing this occupation. There are occupations where the relationships between what you do and what you get back from it are much more reliable than this one, right? For this occupation, I think you really have to feel a calling. You really have to feel like I'm doing something very important, and I'm willing to spend my life on it even if it doesn't pay off very well for me. I had a colleague, Paul Shrivastava, who came up for tenure. He'd been at NYU for 5 years. And in that time, he had published 40 articles. 40 articles. Every one of them was drivel. Just total crap. He would think of some questions. He'd put them in a questionnaire. He'd give the questionnaire to a sort of a random group of people. He'd do a statistical analysis. And he'd write this up as a little pro forma type paper, not very long, and send it to some really bad journal, and the journal would publish it. Right? And you can pile this stuff up very quickly and easily, right? Any of us can do this.
I have a colleague at the University of South Florida who's done this.
Exactly.
By third year review, he had 8 publications in journals that no one in this room has ever heard of. Anyway, I'm sorry.
And they never want to hear of them.
The department chair there came to me after third year review and said, if you want to get tenure, you need to make sure you don't follow his strategy.
During the last year before his tenure review, the Bhopal Explosion happened, the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India. And the New York Times was looking for somebody from Bhopal to go with their reporter to Bhopal to help them. And it turned out that Paul Shrivastava had relatives in the city administration in Bhopal, and he volunteered to go as the reporter, and he went to Bhopal, and he got very interested in how did this all happen, and he wrote a book about the Bhopal event, which was a very, very good book. It was intellectual, it was thoughtful, it was deep in what it dug out. And so when he actually came up for tenure, he had 40 pieces of shit and one really good book. And the question is, what do you do? The faculty had a great argument about this. I was one on the side of the book. And there are 2 or 3 other of the top professors who were on the side of the good book. And we finally persuaded the others to go along, and we gave tenure to Paul. And over the next 3 years, each year he published 3 articles in the top journals. In other words, the Bhopal book had totally changed his perspective about what life was about. He had actually discovered that doing research and doing it in a good way could, in fact, have an effect on the society. And the fourth year, he got offers for chaired professorships elsewhere, and he left NYU. So I've already said this to you before, but I'm reminding you of the problem. But I nevertheless urge people always to submit to highly prestigious journals first, on the expectation that your papers will get rejected, but that you'll get better reviews, more thoughtful reviews from those journals. I'm not saying, well, there's always a chance they'll make the accident, right? They'll pick your paper by accident. Remember how unreliable they are, right? But even if they reject your paper, well, most papers are rejected, so you got to start on the assumption they're going to reject your paper anyway, even if it's a good paper. But the reviewers are going to write more words. You know, some of the good journals, they'll give you 3 pages back from each reviewer or something. So you get a lot of information back. Now, I don't know to what extent this applies here, but these are my statistics on places I've been in the U.S. This reliability of evaluations of research applies to evaluations of people, and is probably even more complex in the case of people, because people have multiple publications like Paul Shrivastava that create a more ambiguous stimulus about what is it we're trying to evaluate. Furthermore, when you evaluate people, you're not really trying to evaluate their past performance. You're trying to make a prediction about their future performance. And we know how good we are at predicting the future, don't we? Right? Not good at all. So the chance that you're going to make a prediction error is very high. I sat with a colleague at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which is a 2nd or 3rd rate university. And we analyzed all the decisions that have been done in the business school. And then we moved ahead about 5 years or more and looked to see how the people done afterward and compared that with the decision. And what we found was that about 33% of the decisions had been wrong. And in that case, the decisions right and wrong were about equally split between type 1 and type 2 errors. Then 15 years later, I sat with another colleague at NYU, and we took all the decisions in the management departments at Wharton, NYU, and Columbia over a 20-year period. And again, we made this analysis to see what had happened. We found that 60% of the decisions had been wrong. Now, that escalation up is because these high prestige schools are biased against promoting somebody if they're the least bit unsure. Right? Wharton went 20 years and never once gave tenure to somebody they had hired with a new PhD.
So is it again the situation that type 1 and type error are balanced, or at least here they...
Well, in Milwaukee they were balanced, and in these prestigious schools they're not balanced, right?
Well, at least. I mean, it will be even worse if they try hard. Like 60% of our heads still there.
Yeah, well, yes. Yes, right. Now, but there's a lesson in this. John Kimberly. Now, John Kimberly I knew when I was at Cornell. He was a graduate student. I was a professor. He took my seminar. He and another student wrote a research study in my seminar, and they published this study. In fact, they published 2 papers out of that study. Then John got a job in the sociology department at the University of Illinois. He went off there, and he worked there for about 5 years. And then they sent me his papers because they were going to evaluate it for tenure. And he had published the 2 papers at Cornell as a student. And then he'd gone 4 years with no publications. And then in his 5th year, he published 13 articles in good journals. So what would be your decision? Ruben, what would you do with this? What would be your recommendation?
to give him the,
You would give him tenure?
like, he invests a lot.
What, do you have any doubts about that?
Yes.
What? What are your doubts?
Consistency. Yes, he's just very uneven.
Yeah, he clearly has the ability to publish very well,
Does
but
he want to?
he may not have the motivation. Exactly. And he may only have published these 13 articles to get tenure, and once he gets the tenure, you'll never hear from him again, right? Illinois decided not to give him tenure. But here's the first point about the message. He got a job in sociology at Yale. No one would think that sociology at Yale was lower prestige than sociology at Illinois. No, it was much better at Yale. He went to Yale and he spent 6 years there. They too turned him down for tenure, and I don't know that. I wasn't part of that decision. I don't know what the situation was. But again, he fell upstairs, not downstairs. He got a job at Wharton. More prestigious than Yale, right? Each time he got knocked down by his environment, he found a way to come back in a better situation. And that's a very important lesson, I think, is that you mustn't let this unreliable, uncertain environment tell you what your life is going to be about.
Is he a nice person? So the people who work with him don't want to deny him.
I don't see him as a bad person at all, if that's what you meant. He's very preppy. He's very New England prep school. Does that make sense for you? For Harvard?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Did you? No.
I guess what's the takeaway from your story here? Because falling upstairs is not common.
Exactly.
It's much easier to go down than up.
Well, yes, yes.
And most people do.
It's a general statement.
Yeah, well, no, but so,
Okay, but who's making that decision? Yes, it's easy to. It's always easier to go down than up. You could do that today.
Right.
Yeah. But is that a good choice to make?
But it isn't fully a choice.
Oh, but it is to a large extent. It's because people who get knocked down give up. They get discouraged. They take something easy to get, right? John Kimberly probably had lots of easy offers, right? But he probably kept hanging in there and selling himself until he got something better. Right? They always give you at least a year, right? On the tenure things, right? Yeah. So you have time to get out there and merchandise yourself. That's how I go fishing. Not clear. You have to develop your own internal gyroscope about which way is north, right? What am I trying to achieve? Am I doing good stuff or am I not doing good stuff? You can't rely on this environment to tell you whether your stuff is good. You can't rely on your colleagues to tell you whether or not you deserve promotions, right? I mean, it's a hard lesson, but I think it's a valid lesson. That the data all say that your environment is a source of uncertainty, not of trouble. And you have to find a way to navigate through this thing despite that uncertainty. Now, I decided early on in my life to increase my sample size. Because each of the articles I wrote might be published well or badly or whatever. I needed to figure out where was my average. And the only way to do that was to produce lots of articles. So that I had a colleague, George Horowitz at Purdue, who in the time I knew him spent 6 years writing a book. It was a book about finance. And I will soon ask Patrick to tell me what that book said, right? Because George Horowitz said this was going to be the great contribution to finance that everybody in finance would know about it. And he spent these 6 years writing this book, and at the end of that time, he couldn't find anybody to publish the book except Purdue University Press. But that made it memorable because it came out in bright yellow and black with the Purdue University colors. So, Patrick, what did George Horowitz contribute?
Not a clue.
Exactly. That's the risk. If you don't build up your sample size, you put all your eggs into a single effort, like Edward Chamberlain, right? You could be Edward Chamberlain or you could be George Horowitz. And it's a very difficult judgment to draw. In some ways, George is right, but whatever he did, it didn't work, right? Now, he wasn't a very sales-oriented guy either, so that's part of it. The other message here is you're fortunate to be in an occupation where there's actually a market for your services. There are multiple universities, there are multiple research institutes, and so if Illinois doesn't like what you do, there's a Yale out there someplace. And so you can go out and into that market and hope to find other consumers of your wares, right? Last fall I was at Birmingham, England, at the University of Aston. And the people at Aston were still talking in 2010 about a mistake they had made in 1968. They had at that time a group of sociologists there that had to label the Aston group. And this Aston group, looking back today, would be 10 of the most successful sociologists in British history. And they got big grants from the British government, and they were doing research that everybody was publishing. They were published in the top journals. And Aston University decided they weren't willing to do whatever was necessary to keep this group there and together, and the group dispersed. A whole bunch went to London Business School, and some went to other places around. So a few went to Canada. And so sometime in the late 60s, they all just dispersed out. And Aston is still sitting there saying, how did we let this happen, right? How did that foolish administration let us lose this gem, right? But they didn't recognize it was a gem. They didn't understand what they had. I decided again, early on, that I would try to start 2 or 3 new papers every year. Some of them I never got published. One whole line of my research I intentionally never submitted to journals because I didn't believe it was worth sharing. So I'm not saying everything you do is going to work out. But if you're going to get yourself a big sample, you're going to have to keep in there. And furthermore, the fact that you're constantly starting something new keeps you from getting too discouraged about the feedback you get on the things you've been doing. Right? There's always something brighter just over the horizon. Now, there are different formulas for how to do this stuff. There's some people go focus on a topic. I knew a guy named Ed Mansfield who was a young economist who got interested in empirical studies of innovation. And he started doing those studies at a time when nobody else in the whole world was the least bit interested in that. He got them into good journals. And eventually he got a lot of recognition. He got a chair at Wharton, right? So he was doing very well. But it meant he only published all of his life on this one theme of, which products are most successful? Are they the first products in the market, the second products in the market, or whatever, right? How much imitation is there? Another way to go at this is to just hunt around for good data. Now, Jeffrey Pfeffer is not an economist. In fact, I don't know what he would be labeled, because he's at Stanford Business School. But he's gone all through his life finding a pile of data, and then saying, what could I do with these data? You'll find some association has a pile of data, and then he'll say, what questions could I ask about those data that would be interesting to somebody? And then he'll find a way to do that. But he gets those studies into good journals because he finds ways to use his imagination to figure out what can I do with the data. Jan Elliott was one of my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He only published 2 papers a year, one in the American Economic Review and one in the Journal of Finance. And he did that every year for 10 years. At which point, he was getting offers for endowed professorships everywhere in the world, right? That's a difficult standard, though, right? That's a very, very difficult standard. Is you only publish a few things, but they're always in the very top journals. He died of a heart attack when he was about 40. And then there's Will Ballmo. Now, Will Ballmo is often talked about as a potential winner of a Nobel Prize in economics. But nobody can ever figure out what did Will Ballmo write that would justify this award, right? He's brilliant. He's at Princeton and at NYU, or he was, maybe he's retired now, but he's highly respected, always in top journals. But it's hard to say, what is it that Will Ballmo did? Obviously, you have to be patient with yourself. I never wrote a doctoral dissertation. My doctoral dissertation committee, at the time I came out, they were giving awards for the best doctoral dissertations of the year. They gave 5 of those every year. And when I said to my committee, what would be a doctoral dissertation, the thesis, they said, well, it would be a document 200 pages long that wins one of those awards. And I found this not an operational concept. I could not figure out how to produce that result. In fact, I couldn't write anything longer than 40 pages. No matter what I wrote, it was only 40 pages or 25 pages or something. Never more than 40 pages. And I was writing on all different topics. I did have one line that I thought I could develop a dissertation about, but I fell into a big argument with Herbert Simon about it. It's such a I thought the demands that he was making were so extreme that I actually ended up in tears, crying in front of him, right? Because I thought what he was asking me to do was not doable. So after about 4 years of this, I was going to quit. I sat around drawing pictures of buildings, and I was going to go back to school and become an architect. At some point, my dissertation chair, Dick Snyder, called me up and said, why don't we just give you the degree without a dissertation? I said, that sounds good to me. So we collected my papers. At that point, I published 13 papers. And they counted that as my dissertation, my published papers, right? But I mean, I'm not saying, I've been very lucky, and various times in my life, lucky things have happened for me, and having a dissertation chair who was prepared to they actually had to get the university to change its rules so that you could get a doctorate without a dissertation. You use an anthology or something for that. Well, so I was lucky that somebody intervened on my behalf. But just generally, I think a lot of us get into this business, and the first few years we're not sure whether we're doing it well enough. And even if we're getting a few things published well, you're unsure of the whole thing. So you have to recognize the emotional pressure that you face. They've been getting worse. This is only done with management journals, but I bet the statistics are the same for all the different fields. 20 years ago, it took somebody 5 years to publish 5 articles in the top journals. And Now it takes 10 years to do exactly the same thing. Why? Because everybody's trying to publish in those same journals, and the competition for those journals has escalated.
And deans all want A publications.
Yeah, you're going to see the numbers tomorrow, not today. The other thing is, if you're going to have an impact on the society, which I think is important, it's part of that business of maintaining some enthusiasm for what you're doing, you have to be repetitious, right? You have to keep banging on it. If I want to discourage people from doing null hypothesis significance tests, I have to keep having talks about null hypothesis significance tests and training sessions and stuff, even though I'm only converting about 50 people at a time, right? I don't see a solution to the problem. You just have to keep trying as long as possible. Well, this is what I was talking about. See, these tests, they were first introduced by Fisher in 1925. The first opposition was voiced by Neyman and Pearson and some other guys in 1930s. They actually, in the 1940s, some statisticians produced actual case examples showing that these tests would produce incorrect results. In the 1990s, a group of psychometricians, that's the statisticians in psychology, they all got banded together and made a formal proposal to the American Psychological Society to ban these things from their book journals. The very first meeting of the committee at the Newark, New Jersey airport, the first decision they made in 10 minutes was not to ban these tests from their journals, no matter what else would happen. The only field in which people really don't like null hypothesis significance tests is medicine. Although there are 24 journals in psychology and education that say if you're going to do these tests, you must give us something about the sizes of the effects as well as the statistical significance. See, that's the central issue, is that you can have meaninglessly small effects and still have statistical significance, or you can have very important big effects and not have statistical significance. So there's not a clear relationship with them. And this is my final topic. And it's at the end because it's the most important. You have to expect a lot of negative feedback. 60% of the reviews by journal reviewers say reject. This is across all different manuscripts. And individual reviewers have a 60% chance of just saying reject this manuscript. And then teacher ratings, although some people are consistently high on teacher ratings and some people are consistently low, they can be quite inconsistent, especially when you teach groups of executives, because the executives sort of clan together, and so they'll form a group opinion that is very hard to break. I have a colleague, Richie Friedman at NYU, and I said to him, Richie, why is it you always get these wonderfully high teaching ratings? And he said, have you ever noticed that about 80, maybe 90% of the students in your classes give you high ratings? And that whether your overall average is high or low doesn't depend on those 80 or 90% of the students. It depends on the 10 or 20% who give you low ratings. If only a few give you a low rating, you get a high overall, and if you get quite a few give you a low rating, you get a low overall. He says, so I start the course and try to identify the students in the class that are most skeptical about what I'm doing. And then I get them into my office and I chat with them and try to charm them into believing that what I'm teaching is really worthwhile. If you're going to be an innovator, you also are going to get negative feedback because you're going to do something that most people think is surprising, doubtful, right? They're going to resist this, it doesn't look familiar, and you're going to have to sell that. So there are all these reasons that you're going to face opposition. But a group of people who help each other can do better as a group than any of you can as individuals. As a group, you can become known as a group. And each of you can do different things, but everybody in the group will share in the credit from the joint activities, right? And you can give each other emotional support and ideas. Now this is my last slide, basically. I learned this by accident. When I left college, I didn't even intend to go to a business school. I wanted to go study more mathematics and design computers. But I went to this business school because I had fights with my father. And I studied physics, and so as a physicist, I chose the world's worst business school. I chose a business school that looked the most like a physics department. And my business school choice was even more stupid. It was not accredited. It was at a third-rate technical institute in a really bad city, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The air in Pittsburgh, there was a steel plant right downtown, and the air in Pittsburgh was almost unbreathable. So here I am at this unaccredited, second-rate, third-rate technical institute, sort of a new school in a really crappy city. And in that time I was there 4 years. There were about 15 professors and 10 doctoral students. Of the 15 professors, 5 have already won the Nobel Prize in Economics. 5 more were nominated for the Nobel Prize in Economics. 2 others won similar awards in psychology and sociology. Of the 10 doctoral students, 1 was sent away because he could not figure out how to do a dissertation, and 9 have become internationally renowned. Now, what do you think is the likelihood that 25 geniuses decided to go to an unaccredited business school in a crappy technical institute in a crappy town? I'd rate the probability very close to 0, wouldn't you? So how can you explain this outcome? It can't be their individual genius. Can't do it. There are many other places in the world that have probably more brilliant people than this group. This group of people, though, pretty much by themselves, they invented operations research, organization theory, the idea of doing computer models of human thought, modern financial theory. Yeah, that's enough. How did it happen? Well, there were four leaders in the faculty. All these stories are going to have a leadership function. Every afternoon, these 4 leaders would go around and make the faculty leave their offices and go to the lounge and have coffee at 3 o'clock. And they would come to these meetings with topics to discuss, like a recent article in a journal or some current event that suggested analysis or whatever. And so in a sense, every afternoon there was a seminar where people sat around in small groups of about this size or smaller around a coffee table and would talk about academic, intellectual topics. And people who were doing research would bring their things in and we would talk about what they were doing. Or these 4 people would always come with some ideas that they had available that they could bring out if nobody else came out with anything. So in a sense, and for a doctoral student, sometimes these afternoon talks would go on for 3 hours because a conversation would just start and people would just keep talking and talking and talking. So when somebody like Modigliani and Miller come popping in with some weird ideas about how it is that restructuring the balance sheets won't in fact have any real effect on the valuation of a stock, You have somebody sitting there to talk with you about it, right? And this would happen over and over again during the time I was there, 5 days a week. There were faculty seminars where somebody would come in and do a talk from outside. Every one of those ended up in a discussion between Herbert Simon and Franco Badigliani about are human beings rational, or do they have limited rationality, right? That was only, essentially all the formal talks were always this one topic, right? But all the other.
So how did you have time, how did anyone have time to get research done if there were these meetings?
That was the first question.
We almost seem to have seminars 5 days a week, not quite, but.
Yeah, well, but these conversations are largely about what you're doing, right? So you're doing research while you're having these talks. If you're actually in a conversation,
Right.
you're not just being there, an audience listening to somebody. But see, well, I think a big part of this, though, is the emotional side of it, that you have colleagues who are interested in what you're doing, and they're sitting there showing that interest by discussing it with you, and probably some intellectual stimulation, too. They're saying, and probably early on, when you're beginning a topic, you're already beginning to see what they might object to, so you can formulate your arguments in a more effective way. Everybody there believed that they were changing the face of business education. That was an overriding theme. They knew that they didn't want it to be like Harvard, they didn't want it to be like Chicago, they wanted a different kind of business education. So they were trying to make things more scientific, more professional, whatever. So, but there was a leadership. There was Bach and Simon and Cooper and Badigliani, who were there all the time making this stuff happen. Then I went to Purdue. And when I got my job offers, I had an offer from MIT, one from Stanford, one from Purdue. And I formulated this list of properties. And I went around and had, for example, I would ask the professors, how much more money is it worth to be at MIT instead of at Purdue? How much more money is it worth to be at Stanford instead of MIT? So, right? And I would get these, and I got maybe 10 or 12 of these evaluations, and I averaged them, and then I had a number for that. And then I asked my wife, how much is it worth to be near the grandparents or far from the grandparents or whatever, right? And I got a number for that. And I got all done, and I add the numbers up, and Purdue comes out as the winner. And I explained this to Franco Badigliani, and he says, how can you be so heartless and calculating? Precisely the thing he'd been advocating all the time I'd been there. I do what he says. How can you be so heartless? He didn't believe it. So, I go to Purdue. Now this is worse than Carnegie, by a long shot. It's not even a business school. It's a management department, or business department. It's called management. And we occupied the basement of the annex to the psychology department. Right? Here I am. I'm in the basement of the annex. Why are we there? Well, fundamentally it's because being close to the grandparents was more valuable than whatever, right? One day, two of my colleagues came in and said, why don't we have some bag lunches? Once a week we'll get together for bag lunches. We'll bring our little sandwiches in, we'll all sit and we'll talk about whatever is interesting to us. It wasn't a formal set of seminars or anything, we just started. The first time we met, there were 5 of us. Gradually over time it grew to 12. And the 12 came from all over the campus, from psychology, from sociology, from political science. And we all saw ourselves as creating a new, more formal, disciplined idea about business research, I guess. You be loose about it. I was doing my lab experiments on 1s and 2s, and Vernon was doing his lab experiments on 20s and 40s. A couple of guys were working on mathematical techniques. They invented something called dynamic programming. A couple of guys were trying to do quantitative studies of history. They called that cliometrics, and they founded a thing called the Cliometric Society. A couple of guys were trying to figure out something they called general equilibrium theory in economics. Of this group of 12, 2 never went anywhere. 1 got a Nobel Prize, that's Vernon Smith. 2 others have been nominated for Nobel Prizes in economics. And of the 2 who stayed at Purdue and never went anywhere, but the other 10 all became internationally renowned. Now, what do you think is the chance that a dozen geniuses decided to go sit in the basement, the psychology department in West Lafayette, Indiana? I rate that probability very near 0, wouldn't you? I think this is another group effect. I think it happens because a group of people come together and have interactions with each other. And they make it happen. There was leadership in this group. There were 2 or 3 people who made sure these meetings happened all the time and whatever, right?
Do you think that it's important that there be a similarity of interests? I mean, on the other hand, cliometrics, experimental economics, and dynamic programming seem to be quite disparate.
But this is both cause and effect. As you begin to interact, you begin to develop shared interests, right? But it's true that those who are drawn into the group are people who are more into formalized stuff, right? More mathematical things, more experimental things. But we had some touchy-feely psych types there too, right?
I guess maybe what I'm asking is, like, from a dean's perspective, is this sort of a hiring issue, hiring people with similar interests, or is this something, we have a population of professors that are already here?
Forcing them to talk.
Yeah. Well, more so than we already do. I mean, we have things that try to replicate some of this already.
If you're talking about what you do here, I think if you could construct at least one central theme of what is this school trying to accomplish, that would be the binding agent. Like Carnegie was trying to revolutionize American business education. And they wanted to make it more scientific, more rigorous, less rooted in practical experience, some more theory, right? And that was sort of what was happening at Purdue too. And it happened that, certainly in both of those cases, it happened to fit a time in history when those ideas were popular. That is, that science was a good thing to do, and mathematical models were the good thing to do, and so on. Right? So they fit with the ethos of the age. Carnegie had a big pile of money coming from the Ford Foundation that helped them a lot, but you guys have that. Purdue didn't have a big pile of money coming. We mostly just had enthusiasm. But we also knew that, we collectively constructed the idea that we wanted to have an impact on the world, and we wanted to do something special. And we said, what in our shared interest would enable us to have a marketable product as a group? Now, my final little example is a very quick little thing. I went to NYU. I'd been there a while. And at some point it became apparent that we had some young women who were very unhappy. And thinking back to my experience at Purdue, I suggested, well, why don't we get together for some bag lunches? And so we had 5 young women, I say young women, they were in their late 20s or early 30s, and 2 older men. All of us did some research related to cognition. And every time we got together, these women complained. The journals don't like what we write. We're discriminated against because we're doing qualitative research. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. And I began complaining to them that they moaned too much, but it was an emotional support group to a large extent. Today, those people meet once a year, the 5 women, and they have a dinner. And they've all become internationally famous. And they call themselves the Moaners, in honor of their behavior back when they were in their 20s. All they really needed was the feeling of getting together in a group and sharing their experiences and helping each other. Oops. We're done.
One of them should be with this big mechanical wings that you see on the first slide.
Are there any questions?
We're done. See you tomorrow.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We look forward to